Green Crow Inn, a novel by Derek A. Kamal, read by Kelman Friedman. Chapter 18. Return of the Wood-goers. Next day was another blur, with tavern, porch, and courtyard decorated for the season, not that many would be out of doors in this clime, and wintertide lager ready to serve. There was little to do but prepare food and tidy up. Calca finally seemed to show some enthusiasm. She bounded round her kitchen from the first light of dawn until noonday without rest. Furrier was first to pitch in, but we would exchange places after a few hours. His taking the first shift gave me ample space to go over the common room once more and to then stare at the door expectantly. No new guests came. "It is not yet being breakfast time in decent places," Sumi offered helpfully, "so do not be so glum." I smiled at her and felt a wave of relief when Furrier emerged from the kitchen practically panting.
"She's a maniac, that one," he said. "Your turn."
I rose from my place at the bar without enthusiasm and entered the kitchen. "First batch of tarts are done." Calca neglected the usual niceties. "Get them out of the oven and put the next batch in." I complied quietly. The little pies smelled heavenly, though I could not tell what exactly they contained. The rich golden-brown crust and the promise of blissful crunch pushed away my fears of being in proximity to the innkeeper. The second tray of tarts slid into the oven without protest, and I stood away from Calca expecting fresh orders, admiring the morning light as it came through the steamy kitchen windows. She paused, rose to her full height, and tied her smooth onyx hair in a bun. I could practically feel her mind working, combing through mental inventories and recipes. Her eyes shut briefly, then opened again, and in a flash she was stirring something I could not see. "Radishes and cabbages are looking soft. Go and fetch them, chop them, and toss them with oil and spices. Bit of vinegar should hide any unpleasantness," she said. Again, I did not bother to vocalize my understanding, and took my time moving downstairs to the cellar. Thankfully, Istru was not there to startle me, but radishes and cabbages are difficult to find in the dark of a cellar. When I finally returned, Calca barked, "What kept you?" "Never mind. Chop." Once her back was turned, I rolled my eyes and fetched the chef's knife, slicing cabbage and radish as deftly as I could manage. The work was not done prettily, but it would suffice for salad. Mid-chop, the innkeeper spoke up. At the sound of her voice, I had to stop my body from flinching, instead steeling myself mentally for another set of terse commands. "I didn't much like my father, either," she said. Adults are often so childish. And that was all. Under normal circumstances, I would lunge at the opportunity for such a conversation, to dig, or pry, as Sumi might say, for more. But I was through trying to understand Calca, much less befriend her. Better to cook in silence and save my energy for the night to come, assuming anyone showed up, of course. When at last my sentence in the kitchen was served, it was lunchtime. The common room, while no doubt warm enough, felt cool compared to the stuffy kitchen. The doors to the Green Crow had been opening and closing, allowing the chill winter air to sneak in. Opening and closing because guests were arriving in abundance. A line had formed at the bar, and Sumi was furiously sorting out rooms. One long row of patient guests ran from bar to door. Men of all sorts, tall and short, fair and dark, in dress of every pattern and hue. Dwarves there were as well, most in hoods and veils, beards hanging proudly across broad chests. I saw no trolls. Wading in without hesitation, I formed a second line, working from memory to place guests wherever there was space. I needed only consult the registry, and thus disturb Sumi, a handful of times. Like timber being chopped down to kindling, the line whittled away until there was only a half-full common room and a near-full inn laden with guests unpacking. As we sorted them out, many expressed their cheer, saying all sorts of things such as, "My, what a lovely tree!" and "We've heard such good things about the Green Crow Inn," and "Looking forward to this remarkable festivity," and the like. In reply, Sumi and I let loose a salvo of propriety, in spite of our flustered state, offering many a "Welcome, we are so glad you could join us," and "We know you will find this a satisfying holiday treat," and so on. Once all began to calm, I had time to look round, and there stood Calca, leaning in the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed as ever. It took a bit of effort, but I ventured a smile her way. It was not reciprocated. Calca retreated to the kitchen again. Before anger had the chance to take hold, I felt Sumi Kind's hand on my arm. "I'd say your idea is already being a success." She smiled warmly and began pouring drinks. Guests continued to trickle in over the course of the afternoon, and soon the Green Crow was at capacity. In response, a cottage industry of hospitality sprang up in minutes. This was led by Gilly, who did not mind accepting a finder's fee as she sorted out who among the travelers would stay at whose home in town and at what cost. Her skill at brokerage was unsurprising. Once housed, however, the multitudes came to the inn, eager for drink, and then, by what could barely be considered the earliest of supper times in reasonable civilization, pies and salads and bread and beer and wine and mead were flying off the shelves of the Green Crow faster than it could be served. I certainly had never seen such an assembly here in my months of employment, but it seemed the others had scarcely had so busy a night either. Tables full, dwarf and man stood nearly shoulder to shoulder. Some loomed over tables to chat with friends, some simply clustered together in no place in particular, and the clangor of talk was loud. Poor Ivor the minstrel, brought in as early entertainment, could scarcely be heard and was principally ignored, though I saw the strain in his vocal cords from behind the bar. Suddenly he ceased to play and slumped his shoulders. The poor man shambled over to the bar and put hand to forehead dramatically, saying,
"My ennui!"
Two dwarves in line for drink grumbled loudly.
"Service!"
Neurgi said to one companion,
"With all the fuss, I thought this lager would be better."
Calca, also working the bar, set her jaw and held back her frustration.
"Go and get Gilrad,"
she shouted at me. I nodded and made a brisk walk to the stables, sweating in spite of the cold. The warmth of the stables was like an oven, and, at capacity, even the soft murmurs of the gentle animals seemed too much. To his credit, Gilrad had the situation in hand. The horses were fed, their ease clearly visible in the mild light of the lanterns. I found the hostler at rest, snacking on a pilfered tart as he watched a speckled mare enjoy her own dinner.
"Ah, Torson,"
he said affably. I responded with a little wave. "Boss says you're needed inside." Gilrad nodded, pursing his lips.
"Very well."
He rose and made way for the door, but stopped abruptly and said to me, without turning,
"Give them all one last look, please. I think I've sorted them all out, but I could use another pair of eyes."
The anxiety was obvious in his voice. This seemed odd, perhaps he was merely overwhelmed, but I accepted the task and took a quick turn about the stables. All the animals seemed well in spite of their overcrowded accommodations. One stall had to be doubled up, but Gilrad put his expertise on display by only allowing 2 mares to bunk together. Smiling fondly, I picked up a brush and approached a large grey one. She needed no grooming, I simply wished to do it. And the horse seemed familiar somehow. The brush stroked her coat neatly, and I felt my brow furrow.
"Ivo!"
I cried in disbelief. This was Nundaya's horse. The mare snorted. "How can—" I trailed off and said nothing. Then the brush was set down. I raced back to the Green Crow as the sun set to the west. The stable had been warm. The common room of the Green Crow was a sweat lodge. Open windows did little to dissipate the heat of the crowd, but instead allowed the sound of conversation from the courtyard and porch to drift inside and add to the volume. Upon entrance, it was plain to see that the crowd had grown, and, with the added assistance of Gilrad, mostly been served. The line for food and drink had returned to a reasonable proportion. The balcony creaked, and everyone stood shoulder to shoulder now, smiling and making conversation in the faint light of the candle and hearth. Ivor had, at long last, won over some fans. A crowd of dads, including Elgad, had slung their arms over his shoulders and joined him in a seasonal tune lamenting the death of the year. They swung their glasses back and forth, mostly on beat. The blending of voices covered Ivor's inability to stay on key. Their partners were present and accounted for and seemed equally merry. Elgad smiled adoringly at who I presumed to be Ilna, his wife, and she in kind. They were a handsome couple. I felt questions fly over and through me. Who is this woman? What is she to do with Calca? Had I been wrong about the innkeeper's affections? But little thought could be spared for that, or for the apparent success of my festive venture, because my eyes hunted for Nundaya. I could not even be bothered to pardon myself as I shoved between bodies in a clean line across the common area. Reaching the further corner revealed no sign of her, no sign of red hair nor of red hood. Furrier, head and shoulders taller than the tallest man in the room, dashed in with a keg on his back, and then retreated towards the cellar, presumably, and I envied his height.
"Ah, the balcony! Ladies and gentlemen!"
A start genuinely shook my body, the voice was so loud. It was loud enough to quiet the packed common room. My quest for the balcony's superior vantage was stopped prematurely.
I am wanting to thank each and every one of you beautiful, attractive peoples for coming tonight.
Sumi Kind stood on the bar. I grimaced, thinking of the poor patina, but found myself admiring my friend. She stood, shoulders back, seeming twice her actual height, though I suppose that was because of her perch. Her usually charming smile had a glamorous quality, and she turned here and there, casting its light upon the crowd. They responded, Nawari regular and out-of-towner alike, by giving her their abject attention and adoration. Now in charge of the entire room, she very comfortably continued.
How are we feeling this fine New Year's evening?
A deafening cheer went up, and then crashed back down into near silence.
That is being very good. But are we feeling fine because of this, she held up a wooden tankard, wintertide ale of ours?
Another joyful roar came and went.
And where is the only place to be finding such a pour?
Green Crow! They shouted as one.
Where?
Green Crow! Kalka remained at the bar to Sumi's side. Her tense shoulders and wry, creased forehead eased, and an expression of pure bliss cracked her normally stony face. I might have sworn there were tears in her eyes as the revelers hailed her in, her only child. She laughed. If she saw or cared or felt jealousy towards Elgad and his wife, I could not see it. Perhaps I'd been wrong about them. Perhaps it was none of my business anyway. If she was angry with me, or Gilrad, or the broader countryside, all was forgiven for the moment, and I was grateful.
Green Crow!
A smaller set of voices rose up and out of the crowd, near the door to the kitchen, with laughter. The quiet held strong, but the crowd moved its attention away from Sumi Kind. Huddled in the doorframe were Skivrun, Herwig, Joymer, and a smattering of their compatriots. They took a few steps into the common area. Elgad and the other locals maintained a steely gaze at their fellow dads from across the room. Joymer, per usual, wore the harness in which he typically carried his child. A few gasps went up among those nearest to him, obviously, for who would keep a baby out until the turn of the year, and in such rowdy conditions? But Joymer's poor taste can be forgiven. It was not his daughter Eartha who rested in the carrier, but a larger person, perhaps the size of an older man-child or young dwarf. Their face was likewise young, if not ageless, and smooth. Their hair, if hair it was, sprouted with a curly green hue. Their eyes were an unearthly yellow and hauntingly familiar. Their skin, well, it may sound unbelievable, but their skin was dark, nutty brown, and textured all over with craggy lines like tree bark. This distinction was faint, and it went unnoticed until I was able to give them a good long look later that evening. So from afar it seemed, by all appearance, that they had recently converted and become beanbacks and were seeing to the care of a young sapling. But the sapling was a person.
"We return!"
bellowed Skivrun, and the crowd stayed hushed.
This has been The Green Crow Inn by Derek A. Kamal, read by Calvin Friedman, with music by Michael Elliott. To find out more, including how to purchase your copy of the novel, please visit shorelessskies.com.